shorter, not substantially shorter, but it feels shorter because Psalm 114, if you have looked at it already, the middle of it is essentially one repetitive block. In any case, here we go. Now, if the Psalm before that we just looked at, Psalm 82, pulls on Canaanite mythology and sort of ideas about enthronement and justice and kingship and like divine kingship, this poem, this psalm feels like it pulls on traditions that we know from Israel's like early history narratives, as we'll see as we go. And I want to think with you about the ways that this poem is and isn't reflecting the stories that we know. Okay, so when Israel went forth from Egypt, I know what story that is. The house of Jacob from a people of strange speech, which is a very long English way of expressing a very short Hebrew sentence. But okay, so when Israel left Egypt, Judah became his holy one. I assume God's holy one. Israel, his dominion. So again, right, like this feels not like what kind of psalm is this? It's not a lament. It's not Thanksgiving. It's not a hymn. It's like a little storytelling. It's very narrative. In fact, it's narrative to the extent that it's using the kinds of grammatical constructions that we almost never find in poetry. Right? It begins with this like temporal construction. When Israel went forth from Egypt, I can think of almost no other examples of that kind of thing happening in poetry. So it starts off with a very prose, even though it's obviously poetry, but a very narrative sense of the thing. It's also doing some lovely wordplay here. Again, if you are reading it and thinking about it in Hebrew, it starts B'tzeit Yisrael, Mitzrayim, B'tzeit Yisrael, when Israel went out, Beit Yaakov. So you've got B'tzeit and Beit, and the very classic pairing of Israel and Jacob. B'tzeit Yisrael, Beit Yaakov, and then Mitzrayim, and then Me'am Lo'ez from Egypt, from a people that talk funny, which is a funny way of thinking about Egypt. Okay, so again, think about what story is being told here. When Israel went forth, Judah became his holy one, Israel his dominion. I like there the fact that it uses Judah and Israel in a pair, right? Making clear that we're not talking about just the southern kingdom or the northern kingdom, but the whole of the thing. Became his holy one, or maybe his holy place, his dominion. So that's kind of like the Exodus story, certainly where Israel goes out of Egypt, and that's when God gives them laws and covenant and tabernacle, and right, the things that fall into the category of like holiness. But it's a very abstracted version of that story, to be sure. And one might ask, like, is this telling of Israel's history beginning with Exodus? That is, what does it think of or know about the stories of Genesis, really, the patriarchal stories? A thing that I have said in courses past, but I suppose I haven't had an opportunity to say here, is scholars tend to think that there are two foundation myths of Israel that both exist in the Bible. One is the one in Genesis, right? We've lived there forever. Our ancestors dwelt there and built altars and buried their dead there, and that's why we're here. And another one that originally said we emerged from Egypt, and that's when God sort of picked us up and adopted us and found us in the wilderness and saved us, and that's when it all started. The story we have canonically blends the two together, but especially as you get out into poetry, into the prophets, into the Psalms, into other texts like that, you see places where you get references like this that look like Israel's story begins with the departure from Egypt, with no knowledge whatsoever of the patriarchs. And what makes this one interesting is it looks like it starts with Exodus, but then it says the house of Jacob, which feels like a call, at least with a name, back to the patriarchs. Okay, next verses. Again, really wonderful to think about what the narrative is here. The sea saw them and fled. The Jordan ran backward. Mountains skipped like rams, hills like sheep. Okay, back to the first part. The sea saw them and fled. If I'm like, it feels familiar, right? Like that's the splitting of the sea in the middle in Exodus. The Jordan ran backward. I kind of know that story too, right? That's from when they crossed the Jordan in the book of Joshua. Um, Two stories that we have in Exodus and Joshua of waters being like stopped for Israel to pass through. But having said that, this doesn't feel quite like the story. Like the sea saw them and fled. Is that the same story we have in Exodus 14? Right? Not quite. This makes it sound like Israel was leaving and the water sort of just naturally did this. This isn't Moses standing there holding his staff. There's no sense here of the Egyptians chasing them. Um, and if we were to see this couplet sort of in the abstract, the sea saw them and fled, the Jordan ran backward. We would think in terms of parallelism, right, that it's actually telling us just one thing, right? It's really about like a body of water or bodies of water um, did something unusual in the face of Israel's moving through the wilderness, which is where we are, right? It is, God has taken them out of Egypt, or they have left Egypt, and now they're on their way to becoming God's, possession. That there's moving toward Canaan, and nature is sort of like this whole verse. These two verses is really about sort of about nature reacting to Israel's just presence. Mountains skip like rams, hills like sheep. You should recognize that. That's almost identical language from what we had in Psalm 29. But so here's a psalm that's picking up, even as it's telling the story of Israel, it's picking up our storm language, right? The mountains skipped like rams. Remember in Psalm 29, that was right, like he made he made Lebanon to skip like a ram. It's almost exactly the same like the same language. Um, and the hills like sheep. So, it's like it feels like it's referring to stories we know, but it's also just talking about the convulsions of nature, which is both storm imagery, as we've seen, of God moving through, and here is imagery of Israel moving through the wilderness, causing the same thing. Again, tying Israel's movement to God's movements. And it's like it's so much packed in. It's narrative, it's storm imagery, it's mythology, it's just so many things going on. It's hard to exactly know where to find a footing here. And then in the next verses, we get virtually the exact same words, um, almost identical, except for the opening word. What alarmed you? Right? In Hebrew, even closer. Right? Like, and those opening words, what alarmed you? That's JPS translation. The Hebrew says, Malacha, like, what's with you? What's with you, O sea, that you ran away? O Jordan, that you ran backwards? O mountains, that you skipped like rams? O hills, like sheep? And what do we think about this? What's up with you? Is it like, is this taunting them? Like, what are you like? What are you scared of us? Is it wonder at what feels like this miracle? Um, Again, and I will add that our translation here puts it in the past tense, right? Like because had when Israel went, then this happened, and so it's logical to say, oh, what happened to you that you should have done that? But in the Hebrew, it's not actually in the past. It's called the imperfect, right? A not completed. If I were reading just in the Hebrew, it would be like, "What's up with you, OC, that you are fleeing?" Oh Jordan, that you are running backward. So it's almost as if the speaker here, and who knows who this speaker is, it doesn't feel like the narrator of the first few verses is like experiencing the thing and like looking around like, what is even happening? Um, uh, and so we get the opening sort of narrative scene of the Exodus. We get this nature convulsing with sort of allusions to narrative elements that we know, and then we get the repetition of it, and then we finish the psalm here. Tremble, O earth, Now again, I'm wondering who it is that's speaking. Tremble, O earth, at the presence of the Lord. So now and this sort of feels like the answer. Like, why are you guys, why nature are you convulsing? Well, you ought to be, right? Because of the presence of the Lord. And you might wonder why it is, by the way, that I didn't capitalize the word Lord here, as most translations do. And it's because this is not the divine name Yahweh. This is just the title, Adon, right? Just means Lord. Uh, so at the presence of, the lowercase title Lord, um, tremble, O earth at the presence of the God of Jacob. Here, another slightly odd word for the deity. Right? Adon is not a super common, right? It's Adon is an Adonai, right? Like that's the standard, at least later Hebrew way of saying God's name. Um, but it's the title here, and then the presence of the God of Jacob, not what we would normally get there, which is Elohei Yaakov from Elohim, but Eloah Yaakov, sort of the singular form of Elohim and a much rarer form. Um, so you should be trembling, O earth, because the God who is leading us through the wilderness um, is the same God who turned the rock into a pool of water, that flinty rock into a fountain. Um, Again, there at the end, that's for sure, right? Again, here's another reference to a part of the story from the Pentateuch, from the Torah that we know. Right, here's the story of God, like getting water from the rock, totally fine. But again, right, look, here's two lines: who turned the rock into a pool of water, the flinty rock into a fountain. Right, that's parallelism, right? That's one event being told in two ways, which makes me look back at the one about the sea and the Jordan and think that might also be one event being told in two ways as opposed to two events. In any case, it's all a little bit vague. Uh, but again, like, is this right? God who turned the rock into a pool of water. That's again like that's a very poetic and even at times prophetic, and we get it in other psalms as well, way of referring to like the Moses hitting the rock with a stick story. It's like these are stories that we know, but given to us not in the forms that we know them. Um, and so I don't actually know the answer as to whether this psalm knows our story. Does it know the Pentateuch? Does the Pentateuch do the Pentateuchal sources know this psalm, or are they all kind of playing with an overarching sort of in the background of the whole thing myth, and this is a poetic representation? Unclear to me. A few other things about this poem before I get to my sort of final thoughts. Um, uh, for all of this, for this entire psalm, uh, Yahweh is never named. Right? If you go back to the beginning, you have the God of Jacob, or here you have the God of Jacob, you have Adon, and you have Eloah, but it never says Yahweh, which I think is interesting. I don't have more to that. It does employ storm imagery, right? If you in the verses before we had right the convulsions of the earth. Here we've got like the earth trembling, chuli. That is again, if you remember Psalm 29, there was the verb of like that we had that same like trembling, convulsing word there. So the related to the word for like he causes. Remember the line, he causes hinds to calve. Same verb, right? Like it's like a twisting, trembling, convulsing word. Um, uh, I'll just show you here since I've got the screen up, right? Like verse 7, the two parts begin with the same word, milifne, milifne Adon, milifne Eloah, but the presence of the Lord, the presence of Lord, the presence of God. And the next line, verse 8, ends with the same words, agam mayim, maino mayim, right? Like a pool of water, a fountain of water. Again, just these little poetic things that make the poem like work artistically.